What would you do if a blizzard, a white death that entombed the world in ice, delivered a miracle to your door for Maeve O'Connell, a woman living in the isolated heart of the Colorado Territory? That miracle was a tiny wailing infant plucked from the arms of his frozen mother. Nursing him back to life gave her a purpose she thought she'd lost forever. But what if that single act of compassion made you a target? What if days later you looked out your window to see not the empty plains, but the silent, unblinking judgment of 50 Apache warriors? This is a story of how one woman's choice to save a life put her at the epicenter of a tribal war, forcing her to make a decision that would either forge a new peace or get her killed. The wind was a living thing. It was a predator, a banshee that had stalked the high plains for 2 days, and now it was closing in for the kill. From the single sturdy window of her small cabin, Maeve O'Connell watched the world disappear. The proud, jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, usually a constant, comforting presence to the west, had been devoured first. Then the scattered pines that dotted the landscape were swallowed whole. Now even the familiar shape of the split-rail fence, just 20 yards from her door, was a ghost, a faint, skeletal suggestion in the swirling chaos of white. Her husband Finn had called this land God's Anvil, a place where souls were hammered into shape, either strengthened or shattered. He had been strong with a laugh as wide as the plains and hands that could calm a spooked horse or coax a garden from the stubborn soil. A rock slide in the high passes 2 years ago had shattered him, and in doing so had hammered Maeve into something hard and solitary. She remained not out of stubbornness, but because the cabin, the very air she breathed, was the last tangible piece of him she had left. The cabin itself was a testament to his strength. Cottonwood logs chinked tight with mud, and faith-formed walls that barely groaned under the assault of the blizzard. The stone hearth which he had built with rocks, hauled from the creek bed a mile away, was the warm, beating heart of their small world. A fire roared within it, now consuming the pine wood she had spent the autumn chopping and stacking. Its crackle was a defiant counter-rhythm to the wind's howl. Maeve ran a hand over the rough-hewn mantelpiece, her fingers tracing the F+M he had carved inside a lopsided heart. 2 years. Had it been so long? Some days it felt like a century. Others she expected him to walk through the door, shaking snow from his broad shoulders, his blue eyes crinkling in a smile as he saw the venison stew simmering over the fire. A particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the north wall, rattling the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Lavender chamomile yarrow. Her mother's knowledge passed down and honed in this unforgiving land. She was a healer of sorts, mending fences for the few ranchers in the valley, setting a bone for a clumsy cowboy, or brewing teas for the colicky babies in the nearby town of Prospect's End. It was a small, quiet existence. The last of the daylight was failing the world outside, turning a deep, bruised purple through the snow. She needed more wood for the night. The pile just outside the door would have to do. Venturing to the main woodshed was a fool's errand now. Pulling Finn's heavy sheepskin coat over her own woolen dress, she wrapped a scarf around her head and neck, bracing herself. The moment she unlatched the heavy plank door, the storm barged in like an unwelcome drunk. It shoved her back, stealing the warm air from the cabin and replacing it with a breath of crystalline cold. Snow as fine and sharp as sand blasted her face. She lowered her head and pushed out the wind, immediately trying to rip the door from her grasp. She wrestled it shut, the latch catching with a reassuring thud. The woodpile was a small mound, already half buried in a drift. Working quickly, her gloved hands numb, she gathered an armful of logs. The cold was a physical pain sinking its teeth into her bones through the thick layers of clothing. It was a killing cold. Finn had always warned her about the white death, blizzards that came on so fast they could trap a man yards from his own home, leaving him a frozen statue for the spring thaw. She was about to turn back her arms full when she heard it. It wasn't the wind. The wind shrieked and moaned and roared. This was a different sound. Thin, reedy, and pathetic, it was almost carried away by the gale, but she caught it. A cry. It sounded like a lamb lost and terrified. But there were no lambs here, not in this weather. She stood, frozen, listening. The wind howled, and for a moment she thought she'd imagined it. A trick of the storm, but then it came again, sharper this time, a desperate, piercing wail that cut through the tempest's fury. Against all reason, against every instinct for self-preservation that screamed at her to get back inside, Maeve dropped the logs and pushed deeper into the blinding snow toward the sound. She couldn't see more than 5 feet ahead. The world was a churning vortex of white. "Hello!" she shouted, her voice immediately snatched from her lips and thrown into the void. She followed the sound, one hand outstretched her boots, sinking deep into the new-fallen powder. It was coming from the direction of the small cluster of cottonwoods that marked the trail to the creek. The crying was weaker now, intermittent. Then her outstretched hand hit something. It wasn't the rough bark of a tree. It was soft, covered in hide and frozen solid. She recoiled for a second before her mind processed it. She brushed away the snow. It was a human form huddled at the base of a tree, a thick buffalo robe clutched around it. It was a woman. An Indian woman, judging by the intricate beadwork on her moccasins, which were barely visible in the snow. Her face was turned away, her long black hair matted with ice. Maeve felt for a pulse at the frozen neck, already knowing it was hopeless. The flesh was as cold and hard as iron. The poor soul had likely laid down to rest for just a moment, and the sleep had taken her. A wave of sorrow washed over Maeve. To die alone out here in the heart of this merciless storm. As she began to say a silent prayer, the sound came again, muffled and weak from within the frozen woman's embrace. With fumbling, numb fingers, Maeve pried at the stiff buffalo robe. The frozen arms were locked tight. It took all her strength, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps to pull the robe open. And there, nestled against the cold breast of his dead mother, was a baby. He was wrapped in layers of rabbit fur, his tiny face a blotchy, angry red from the cold and the crying. But he was alive. His eyes were squeezed shut, his mouth open in a soundless wail, his body trembling violently. He couldn't have been more than a few months old. For a heartbeat, Maeve was paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of it. A living child, a flicker of warmth in the heart of a frozen tomb. The mother's last act, her final ounce of fading body heat, had been to shield her child from the white death. The paralysis broke. The baby's shivering was weakening. He was dying. Without a second thought, Maeve scooped him up. He was shockingly light. She unbuttoned Finn's heavy coat, pulled the baby inside against her own warmth, and buttoned it up again, creating a cocoon of sheepskin and wool. His tiny, cold body was a shock against her own. "It's all right," she whispered, the words lost to the wind. "I've got you. I've got you." She gave the frozen woman one last sorrowful look. There was nothing more she could do for her. Leaving her to the storm felt like a desecration, but survival was a brutal, selfish calculus. She had to get the baby inside. Now, turning her back on the dead, Maeve O'Connell clutched the precious living bundle to her chest and fought her way back through the raging blizzard, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm of terror and a fierce, newfound purpose. She had a life to save. The journey back to the cabin, though it couldn't have been more than 50 yards, felt like a desperate trek across a frozen continent. The wind tore at her, a physical force, trying to rip the child from her arms. Snow blinded her, and the drifts, now deeper, conspired to trip her to pull her down into their suffocating embrace. Maeve focused on a single point of light, the faint orange glow of the fire visible through her cabin window. It was a beacon, a promise of life. She stumbled onto the porch, her legs shaking with cold and exertion, and fumbled with the latch. The door swung open, and she fell inside, landing on her knees on the rough wooden floor. The warmth of the cabin enveloped her so starkly different from the frozen hell outside that it made her dizzy. She pushed the door shut with her foot, the bar falling into place, with a heavy thunk sealing them in, sealing the storm out. For a moment she just knelt there, gasping for breath, the child a small, cold weight against her chest. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackling fire and the muffled roar of the wind. She could feel the baby's tremors through her dress, a fragile, frantic vibration that was growing weaker. There was no time to waste. Carefully she unbuttoned the coat and lifted the baby out. His skin had a terrifying bluish tinge, and his lips were pale. His eyes were closed, and the crying had stopped, replaced by a shallow, hitching breath. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize her, but she pushed it down. Finn was gone. She was alone. She had to be the strong one now. She carried the infant to the hearth, laying him gently on the thick, bear-skin rug Finn had cured years ago. She stripped off his cold, damp rabbit fur wrappings, revealing a tiny body clad in a simple buckskin shirt. He was so small, so perfect. Working quickly, she heated water in a small pot over the fire, testing it constantly with her finger until it was just warmer than lukewarm. She soaked a strip of clean linen in the water and began to gently rub his tiny limbs, starting with his feet and hands, trying to stimulate the circulation without shocking his system. "Come on, little one," she murmured, her voice a low, steady prayer. "Come on now. Fight. You have your mother's fight in you. I know you do." His skin was like ice to the touch. She worked tirelessly, rewarming the cloth, rubbing his chest, his back, his little legs. She could see the life in him was a guttering candle flame threatening to be extinguished with every passing second. She needed to get his core temperature up. Rummaging through a wooden chest at the foot of her bed, she pulled out a set of Finn's woolen underclothes. They smelled faintly of him, of pine smoke and clean sweat, and a pang of grief shot through her. She pushed it away. This was no time for sorrow. She took Finn's old shears and quickly cut one of the shirts down, fashioning a makeshift gown for the baby. She wrapped him in it, then swaddled him in the softest, warmest wool blanket she owned. Holding him close to her body, she sat in the rocking chair by the fire, her own warmth seeping into him. She rocked slowly, rhythmically, whispering nonsense words of comfort, the same way her mother had once comforted her. The baby remained terrifyingly still, his breathing shallow. Doubt began to creep in. What was she doing? She knew how to set a bone, how to stitch a wound, how to brew a tea for a fever. But this was a life teetering on the very edge of existence. What if she did the wrong thing? What if he died here in her arms? He was a Comanche. Baby, that much was clear from his mother's attire and the cradle board lying half buried beside her. If his people came looking for him, what would they think, finding him dead in a white woman's cabin? She looked down at the tiny face, serene now in the firelight. The bluish tint was slowly, almost imperceptibly receding. A faint flush of pink was returning to his cheeks. His chest rose and fell with a slightly deeper, more regular rhythm. He was fighting, Relief, so potent it was almost painful, washed over her. She felt tears well in her eyes, hot against her cold cheeks. He was going to make it. The next few hours were a blur. She managed to warm some of the goat's milk she kept, and using a strip of cloth soaked in it, painstakingly dripped the life-giving liquid into the baby's mouth. At first, he didn't respond. Then his instincts kicked in. His mouth began to work a weak but determined suckling motion. He took only a little, but it was enough. As the blizzard continued to rage outside, a quiet domestic peace settled within the cabin walls. Maeve rocked the child, humming old Irish lullabies Finn's mother had taught her. She had never held a baby for this long. She and Finn had wanted. Children had spoken of it in hushed, hopeful tones in the dark of night. They had even picked out names. A boy would be Adam, a girl Rose. But the years had passed, and her womb had remained barren. It was a quiet, private grief that she had buried alongside her husband. Now this child, this impossible gift from the storm, was asleep in her arms. His tiny hand, which had been clenched in a tight, cold fist, had relaxed. His fingers had curled around one of hers, a grip of surprising strength. Looking at him, she felt a powerful protective surge that startled her. It was fierce and primal. He was hers to protect. He was a stranger from a people often at odds with her own, but in that moment none of it mattered. He was a baby who needed a mother, and she was a woman who had ached to be one. She needed to call him something. He deserved a name. Adam, she whispered, testing the sound in the quiet room. It felt right. A new beginning. Adam? The baby stirred, a soft sigh escaping his lips. His dark eyes fluttered open for the first time. They were deep brown and unfocused, but they looked right at her. There was no fear, no recognition, just the pure, unfiltered presence of a new soul. In that gaze, Maeve O'Connell felt the last of the ice around her own heart begin to crack. She had saved him from the blizzard, but she had a feeling he was also saving her. She was no longer just the widow O'Connell, the lonely woman in the hills. She was a guardian, a protector. And as she held Adam close, the firelight dancing on his face, she knew with a chilling certainty that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that might be coming. She had taken something that did not belong to her, and sooner or later, someone would come to claim it. The blizzard broke on the third day. The wind died down to a whisper, and a pale, watery sun emerged, casting a brilliant, blinding glare across a world reborn in white. The silence was as profound as the storm's fury had been. Maeve stepped out onto her porch, blinking against the light, and gazed at a landscape transformed. The plains were a vast, undulating sea of snow, the drifts sculpted by the wind into soft, elegant shapes. It was beautiful, but it was a cold, desolate beauty. Beneath a drift near the cottonwood trees lay Adam's mother, a silent, frozen monument to a mother's love. Maeve knew she couldn't leave her there. With Finn's shovel, she spent the better part of the morning digging a grave in the unyielding, frozen earth. It was brutal work, each shovelful a painful effort. She wrapped the woman in a clean canvas sheet, the only shroud she could offer, and laid her to rest in the shallow grave, marking it with a cairn of river stones. She said a few words, a prayer to a God she hoped listened to all his children, regardless of their skin or their tribe. Life with Adam settled into a new rhythm. The small cabin, once a haven of solitude and memory, was now filled with the small sounds of a new life. The baby's soft coos, his occasional cry for milk, the gentle creak of the rocking chair. Maeve found a new purpose in the endless cycle of feeding, changing, and soothing. The hollow ache in her chest, the constant low-grade hum of grief for Finn, was still there, but it was now overlaid with a new urgent melody. She fashioned diapers from old flour sacks, boiled and softened until they were gentle on his skin. She carved a crude but functional rattle from a piece of soft pine. She sang to him, her voice rusty from disuse, filling the cabin with forgotten lullabies. He was a good baby, watchful and calm. His dark, intelligent eyes seemed to follow her every move. When he smiled a gummy, unrestrained grin, it was as if the sun had finally broken through the clouds of her own long winter. After a week, her supplies began to run low. The goat's milk was nearly gone, and she needed flour salt and coffee. The trip to Prospect's End was a necessity, but it was one she now dreaded. The town was a collection of dusty clapboard buildings, a place of hard-working people who were also deeply suspicious of anything or anyone out of the ordinary. A lone woman living in the hills was already an oddity. A lone woman with a new Indian baby would be a firestorm of gossip and judgment. She couldn't leave Adam alone. With a heavy heart, she wrapped him securely in a sling made from a wool blanket, tucking him inside her coat, where he would be warm and hopefully hidden. She hitched her placid old mare Bess to the small buckboard and set off the runners gliding silently over the packed snow. The air in Prospect's End was thick with the smell of wood smoke and manure. Men in heavy coats stopped and stared as she guided the buckboard down the main street. Their gazes were curious but held a hard edge. She tied Bess to the hitching post outside the general store, her heart thumping against her ribs. The store's proprietor, a sour-faced man named Horace Gable, peered at her over his spectacles. "Maeve, storm treat you all right?" "It did, Horace. Just running low on a few things," she said, trying to keep her voice even. She moved through the store, gathering her supplies, acutely aware of the other customers, a couple of miners and Horace's wife Mildred, a woman whose tongue was known to be the sharpest instrument in the county. As Maeve placed her items on the counter, a small gurgling sound came from inside her coat. Mildred Gable's eyes narrowed. "What was that?" Maeve's face flushed. "Nothing." But Adam, as if on cue, let out a louder, more insistent cry. There was no hiding it now. With a resigned sigh, Maeve opened her coat. The sight of the dark-haired baby, with his distinctively native features, brought a collective gasp from the small audience. "Good Lord in heaven," Mildred whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Where did you get that?" "I found him," Maeve said simply, her voice firmer than she felt. "His mother. She didn't make it through the storm." Horace Gable stared, his mouth agape. "A Comanche babe? Are you mad, woman? Their raiding parties were spotted not 50 miles from here 2 months ago. You can't keep it." "He's not an it, Horace. He's a baby," Maeve retorted, her protective instincts flaring. "And I'm not leaving a child to die." She paid for her goods, her hands trembling slightly as she counted out the coins and left the store under a cloud of shocked silence and disapproval. She had just loaded her supplies when Sheriff Brody approached. He was a tall, weary-looking man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much trouble. "Maeve," he said, his voice low, "folks are talking. Is it true what the Gables are saying? If they're saying I took in an orphaned baby, then yes, it's true." Brody sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "This is a dangerous game you're playing. The army has put a bounty on any hostiles found off the reservation. And if his people come looking for him, well, they won't knock politely. This could bring a whole world of trouble down on all of us. He's not a hostile sheriff. He's a baby. His mother is dead. What was I supposed to do?" The sheriff looked at the small, peaceful face peeking out from her coat. He saw not a savage, but a child. His hard expression softened for a fraction of a second. "Just be careful, Maeve. Lock your doors. And keep that rifle of Finn's loaded." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Maeve feeling more isolated than ever. The ride home was tense. She felt 100 eyes on her back. She had crossed a line, broken an unwritten rule of the frontier. She had blurred the boundary between their world and the other, and she knew people wouldn't forget it. The days that followed were filled with a gnawing anxiety. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a branch in the woods sent a jolt of fear through her. She kept Finn's old Winchester rifle propped by the door, its cold metallic presence a constant reminder of the sheriff's warning. She began to notice things. Small, unsettling signs. A track in the snow near the creek that was not hers, or an animal's, a single moccasin print, deep and clear, that had been deliberately brushed over. One morning she found a small grey hawk feather placed carefully on her woodpile, a marker of some kind she didn't understand. She wasn't just being paranoid. She was being watched. The shadow was there, just beyond the edges of her clearing, a silent, patient observer. She never saw them, but she felt them. It was a primal instinct, a prickling on the back of her neck that told her she and Adam were no longer alone. They weren't judging her with gossip like the people in town. They were waiting. She doubled her vigilance, sleeping in short, fitful bursts, the rifle by her bed. She held Adam closer. Her love for him, now mingled with a fierce, desperate fear. She had saved him from the storm, but she had delivered him into a new, unknown danger. The thaw had come, but a shadow had fallen over their small world, and Maeve O'Connell knew in her bones that it was gathering, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It happened a week after her trip to town. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered plains in hues of blood orange and deep violet. Maeve was inside, humming softly as she stirred a pot of rabbit stew, the savory aroma filling the small cabin. Adam was asleep in his makeshift cradle near the hearth, his chest rising and falling in the peaceful, rhythmic pattern that never failed to soothe her own anxious heart. For a few fleeting moments, all was right in the world. It was a fragile domestic scene she could have almost believed was real, permanent. The first sign that her fragile peace was about to be shattered was her mare Bess. The old horse, usually placid to the point of lethargy, let out a sharp, nervous whinny from her small lean-to. Maeve paused, spoon in mid-air. She went to the window, peering out into the deepening twilight. She saw nothing but the familiar shapes of the trees and the vast, empty expanse of snow. She tried to dismiss it, a coyote perhaps, or a deer straying too close. But then she saw the birds. A flock of evening grosbeaks that had been chattering in the pines suddenly burst into the air in a silent, panicked explosion. Something had disturbed them. Something large. Her blood ran cold. She moved silently to the door, her hand reaching for the Winchester. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She slid the small peephole cover Finn had installed her eye, pressing against the cold wood. At first she saw nothing. The clearing was empty. And then she understood. They weren't in the clearing. They were already there. Her eyes scanned the tree line, the edge of the woods that bordered her small homestead. A flicker of movement. Then another. They emerged from the shadows, not with a sound, but like the shadows themselves, detaching from the trees. One by one, then, in groups of 2 and 3 warriors materialized in the gloaming. They moved with a chilling, preternatural silence, their moccasined feet making no sound on the crusted snow. They were not Comanche. She could tell by the markings, the style of their buckskins, the way they wore their hair. These were Apache. Maeve's breath caught in her throat. She counted. 10, 20, 30. They just kept coming, fanning out in a semicircle, their movements economical and deliberate, until her small, defiant cabin was surrounded. There had to be 50 of them, 50 armed warriors, their faces grim and impassive in the fading light. They held bows, lances, and some carried rifles. They were a silent, deadly army, and she was at their center. This wasn't a raid. A raiding party was loud, chaotic. This was something else. This was an assembly, a judgment. Panic seized her. Her mind raced. The rifle. She could fire a shot, maybe take one or two of them before they overwhelmed her. But what then? They would burn the cabin to the ground, with her and Adam inside. There was no escape. Sheriff Brody and his one part-time deputy were miles away, a lifetime away. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Adam chose that moment to stir in his cradle, letting out a soft, sleepy cry. The sound, so innocent and pure, cut through Maeve's fear. It wasn't just her life on the line. She looked from the sleeping child to the army outside her window. Her terror solidified into a hard, defiant resolve. She would not cower. She was Maeve O'Connell. This was her home, and she would protect the child in her care. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she leaned the rifle against the wall, a deliberate act of non-aggression. She walked to the door, her hand hesitating for only a second over the thick wooden bar. She lifted it. The sound echoed in the silent cabin like a gunshot. She pulled the heavy door inward and stepped onto the porch, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the biting evening cold. She stood there, a lone woman in a simple woolen dress, facing a silent crescent of 50 warriors. She met their dark, unreadable eyes, refusing to look away, refusing to show the fear that was churning in her stomach. For a long moment, nothing happened. The world was utterly still, the only sound, the soft sigh of the wind through the pines and the distant crackle of her fire. The warriors stood like statues of clay and leather, their breath misting in the cold air. Then one of them moved. He stepped forward from the center of the line. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a presence that commanded authority without a word. His face, stark and angular, was framed by long black hair held back by a simple leather band. He wore no war paint, but his expression was more intimidating than any painted visage. His eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to look right through her, to weigh the very essence of her soul. He stopped 10 feet from her porch. He did not speak. He simply stood there, watching her. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon in itself, designed to unnerve her, to break her. Maeve held her ground, her chin held high. She would not be the first to break. Finally, he raised a hand, palm open in the universal sign of peace, though it felt anything but peaceful. He spoke his voice, low and guttural, a language she did not understand. The words were hard, like stones rattling in a dry riverbed. Maeve shook her head slowly. "I don't understand you," she said, her own voice surprisingly steady. The leader's eyes narrowed slightly. He spoke again, pointing a long, deliberate finger, not at her, but at the cabin door behind her. The meaning was clear. He knew. He knew the baby was inside. Maeve's heart hammered. This was the moment of truth. She took a half step back, positioning herself squarely in the doorway, blocking it with her own body. "He is safe," she said, speaking as much to herself as to him. "He is warm and fed. He is safe." The warrior took a step forward. Maeve stood her ground. Another warrior, a younger man, stepped to his leader's side and spoke to him in their native tongue, his tone urgent. The leader listened, his gaze never leaving Maeve's face. Then the leader looked at her and spoke a single broken English word, his voice raspy with disuse. "Boy." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a demand. Maeve swallowed hard. The entire world seemed to have shrunk to this small patch of frozen ground, to the space between a lone woman and a warrior king. She met his gaze, the protector of a child facing the man who had come to claim him. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the twilight. "A boy." The warrior's stoic expression flickered with something she couldn't read, grief, relief, anger. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. He had come for the child she called Adam, and Maeve knew with a terrible certainty that he would not leave without him. Her act of mercy in the blizzard had finally brought the reckoning to her door. The standoff on the porch continued, a silent war of wills waged in the frigid twilight. The Apache leader, whose intense gaze had not wavered from Maeve, seemed to be waiting for her next move. Maeve, in turn, refused to yield the doorway. She was a dam holding back an ocean, and she could feel the immense pressure building. The younger warrior, who had spoken to the leader, stepped forward. He was leaner than his chief, with a watchful, intelligent face. He stopped beside his leader and addressed Maeve, his English, halting but clear-honed perhaps from tense encounters at army forts or trading posts. "He is Taze," the young warrior said, gesturing with his chin toward the imposing leader. "He does not wish you harm. He wishes to see the child." Maeve's eyes flicked from the translator to Taze, then back. "The child is sleeping. He is weak. He almost died in the storm." "We know," the translator said, his voice softening with an unexpected note of sorrow. "We followed the tracks. We found her, the mother." The word hung in the air between them. Maeve's defensive posture eased almost imperceptibly. They were not here as faceless aggressors. They were here because they were grieving. "I buried her," Maeve said quietly, with respect. "Over there under the stones." She pointed toward the simple cairn, now barely visible in the darkness. Taze's gaze followed her finger. He spoke in Apache, his tone low and somber. The translator, whose name she would learn, was Hask, listened before turning back to Maeve. "Our ways were not followed, but our hearts." "Thank you for your kindness to the dead," Hask said. "Now we must see the child. We must know he lives." Maeve hesitated. To let them in felt like a surrender, but to refuse might be seen as an act of hostility, a challenge they would surely answer. Looking at the 50 warriors standing like silent sentinels, she knew she had no real choice. Her only hope was to show them she was not a threat. "One of you," she said, her voice firm. "You," she nodded at Taze, "and you the translator. The others stay where they are. You will not enter my home with weapons." Haski translated her terms. Taze listened, his expression unreadable. He gave a short, sharp nod. He handed his rifle to the warrior beside him and unstrapped the knife from his belt. Haski did the same. It was a gesture of trust, a fragile bridge being built across a vast cultural chasm. Maeve stepped back, holding the door open. The two men mounted the porch and entered the cabin. They dwarfed the small room. Taze's eyes swept over everything, taking in the tidy shelves, the drying herbs, the worn furniture, and Finn's lopsided heart carved into the mantel. His gaze finally settled on the cradle by the fire. He moved toward it, not with the stride of a warrior, but with a slow, cautious reverence. He knelt beside the cradle, his large frame casting a long shadow in the firelight. He looked down at the sleeping baby, at Adam, for a long, silent moment. A muscle worked in his jaw, and Maeve saw a profound, deep-seated grief in his eyes that transcended language. "Nantan." He whispered the name, a soft exhalation of breath. It was the first sign of vulnerability she had seen in him. Adam, perhaps sensing the new presence, stirred and opened his eyes. He didn't cry. He simply looked up at the large, unfamiliar face above him. Taze slowly extended a finger. his hand calloused and scarred from a life of war and survival, and gently touched the baby's cheek. He then looked up at Maeve, his eyes asking 1,000 questions. It was Haska who provided the answers. He stood near the door, a respectful distance away, his voice low so as not to wake the other warriors' curiosity. "The boy's mother," he began, "was named Morning Dove. She was Tazay's sister." The word struck Maeve with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a tribal leader. This was the child's uncle. Her heart ached for him, for the loss he had so stoically hidden. "But the boy is not Apache," Haski continued, and here was the twist that explained everything. Morning Dove, she gave her heart to a man from another people, a people who have long been our enemy. She ran away to be with him. His name is Stone Hoof. He is a chief of the Nemenu, the Comanche. Maeve sank into a nearby chair, her mind reeling. An Apache woman and a Comanche chief. A forbidden love, a story as old as time, played out on the vast, unforgiving stage of the American West. It explained the mother's presence so far from her people, alone in a blizzard. "For 2 seasons there has been talk," Hask explained. "The whites are pushing from the east. The soldiers build more forts. The buffalo disappear. The old hatreds between our peoples are a luxury we can no longer afford. Tazay and Stone Hoof, they are younger leaders. They see a new way. They agreed to a secret council, a meeting to forge an alliance to join their strengths." He gestured to the baby who was now gripping Tazay's finger. Nantan was to be the bridge between our peoples, the son of a Comanche chief and an Apache woman, a symbol of a new generation. A living treaty. Morning Dove had been traveling to meet Stonehoof's party for the parley when the blizzard, the White Death, had struck, catching her in its deadly embrace. Tazay and his warriors were the Apache delegation on their way to the same meeting place. When his sister did not arrive, they had followed her trail, a trail that led them to a lonely grave and, miraculously, to this cabin. "You saved more than a baby woman of the lonely house," Haski said, his eyes filled with a new respect. "You saved the hope for peace." Maeve looked from the solemn translator to the powerful chief who was now murmuring softly to his nephew in their native tongue. She had stumbled into the middle of a delicate, high-stakes drama of tribal politics, love, and survival. The small child she had named Adam was not just an orphan. He was a prince, a symbol, the linchpin of a fragile and desperate alliance. Tazay rose to his full height, his gaze meeting Maeve's over the cradle. The hardness was gone, replaced by a look of profound, weary gratitude. He spoke again in Apache, his voice soft, but carrying the weight of command. Haski translated. "He says his people, the Chiricahua Apache, are in your debt. He asks your name." "Maeve," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Maeve O'Connell. Maeve O'Connell." Tazay repeated, testing the foreign sounds on his tongue. He nodded slowly. "Your name will be remembered." He had what he came for. He had found his sister's child alive and well. Maeve assumed he would take the baby and leave their strange, terrifying encounter concluded. But as Tazay turned from the cradle, his expression shifted again, becoming grave and calculating. The relief of finding Nantan was already being replaced by the weight of the problem that still remained. He spoke to Haski, his words short and urgent. Haski turned to Maeve, his face serious. "The council with the Comanche is in 3 days' time. They are waiting, but they are a proud and suspicious people. They will not believe our story. They will see the child's mother is dead and think it is Apache treachery. The word of an enemy is wind. The alliance will die, and a new war, a bloodier war, will begin." Maeve felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She knew what was coming next. Taze says there is only one way. Hasker continued, his gaze locking with hers. They need a witness, someone neutral, someone whose word is beyond the blood feuds of the tribes. They need the white woman who found the child. They need you. The request hung in the air of the small cabin, heavier and more dangerous than the armed warriors waiting outside. They didn't just want the baby. They wanted her. They wanted Maeve to leave the sanctuary of her home and ride with them into the heart of a conflict she had no part in. No, the word escaped her lips before she could think. I can't. It's not my place. I'm a stranger to your affairs. Taze's face remained a stony mask, but Maeve saw a flicker of grim resolve in his eyes. He spoke his tone hard and unyielding. This is not just our affair. Hask interpreted his own voice, losing its earlier softness. The Comanche will not believe our story. They will see the child's mother is dead and think it is Apache treachery. The alliance will die, and a new, bloodier war will begin. That blood will not be contained. It will spill across this land, to the ranches, to the towns. No one will be safe. Your world will burn along with ours. It was a threat cloaked in the cold logic of necessity. Maeve's mind spun. To ride with the Apache was to become their ally in the eyes of the U.S. Army. A patrol would shoot first and ask questions later. And what if the Comanche Hasker had called them suspicious? They could see her as part of an elaborate trap, a pawn to be sacrificed. The people of Prospect's End, who already saw her as a fool for saving one child, would brand her a traitor. She might never be able to return. Her fear was a cold, sharp thing whispering for her to bar the door and take her chances. But then her gaze fell to the cradle, to the small, innocent child at the center of this storm. Nantan. Adam. She had saved his life, and in doing so had bound her fate to his. Her promise to protect him, made in the quiet of her own heart, was now being called to account. Could she hand him over, knowing that without her testimony, his life might be the spark that ignited a devastating war? Knowing his father might reject him out of grief and suspicion. This was no longer about her own safety. It was about finishing what she had started in the blizzard. It was about honoring a mother's final desperate act and ensuring a father knew that act had not been in vain. Finn had always told her, "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Maeve. It's doing what's right when you're scared to death." She stood up, pulling her shoulders back, her decision made. "I will go," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will tell them what I saw. I will place the child in his father's arms." A wave of relief washed over Hasker's face. Taze gave another short, sharp nod, a sign of profound respect. "But I have conditions," Maeve added firmly. "The boy stays with me until we reach the council. I will care for him. I will not carry a weapon. I come as a witness, not a warrior. My safety and the boy's will be your responsibility." Taze listened to the translation and responded immediately. "He agrees," Hasker said. "You will be honored. No harm will come to you. The Chiricahua give their word." As Maeve packed a small bundle, the sounds of the warriors outside preparing their horses were interrupted by a new sound, the thud of a shod horse approaching at a trot. Husky and Taze stiffened. Maeve rushed to the window and saw a single rider carrying a lantern. It was Sheriff Brody. Someone from town had sent for him. "Lawman," Maeve explained quickly. "He's alone." Sheriff Brody reined in his horse 50 feet from the line of warriors, his hand resting on his pistol, his face pale as he took in the overwhelming force. "Maeve!" he shouted. "Maeve O'Connell, are you all right?" Before Taze could react, Maeve made a decision. Holding Nantan securely, she walked back onto the porch. "I'm all right, Sheriff. We were just talking." Brody stared, his eyes wide. "Talking Maeve, for God's sake. Get back in the house. This is an Apache war party." "I'm not a hostage," she called out, her voice calm. "This is the boy's family. They've come for him, and I am helping them." The sheriff was utterly confounded. "Helping them, Maeve? This is madness." Taze spoke to Haska, who then relayed the message to Maeve. "Tell the lawman he is declaring war if he interferes. The woman is an honored guest under our protection." Maeve relayed the message, softening the tone, but keeping the core warning. Sheriff Brody sat on his horse, a lone man of the law, facing a situation for which no law was written. He looked at Maeve's determined face, at the 50 silent warriors, and at the sleeping baby who was the cause of it all. With a heavy sigh of resignation, he slowly took his hand from his pistol. "I must be losing my mind," he muttered. Then louder to Maeve, "If you're not back in a week's time, I'm coming with a posse." "I'll be back," she promised. Sheriff Brody gave one last, disbelieving shake of his head and wheeled his horse around, riding back toward town. The weight of her promise had been tested, and she had not buckled. Now all that was left was the journey. The journey began under a canopy of cold stars. Maeve rode her mare Bess, a strange figure amongst the Apache war ponies, clutching Nantan's warmth against the vast freezing silence. The 50 warriors moved around her like a flowing river, their efficiency and discipline a stark contrast to the chaotic tales told in town. Her initial fear slowly gave way to a grudging respect. They shared their food, protected her from the wind, and treated her not as a prisoner, but as the honored guest they had promised. They traveled for 2 days, moving through hidden canyons and trackless forests. On the morning of the 3rd day, they arrived at a hidden valley ringed by towering red rock. Below, a party of Comanche warriors waited around a small fire, their leader, a tall, grim-faced man who could only be Stone Hoof. The air crackled with generations of hatred as Taze, Maeve, and 10 warriors descended to meet them. Taze spoke first, his words translated by Hask, telling the story of the blizzard and the discovery of his sister's body. Stonehoof's face hardened into a mask of rage. "You lie." He spat, his voice thick with grief. "You killed her, and now come with a story to lure us into a trap. There will be no peace, only blood for blood." His warriors reached for their weapons, and the valley held its breath on the knife's edge of violence. "Wait!" Maeve's voice cut through the tension. She stepped forward, standing between the 2 chiefs. "He does not lie," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I am the one who found her. She died protecting him. There was no treachery, only a mother's love and a terrible storm." Stonehoof's eyes bored into her. "Words are wind. Where is this child?" With trembling hands, Maeve opened her coat, revealing the baby. Nantan, warm and safe, blinked in the morning sun. A collective gasp went through the Comanche. Stonehoof froze, his anger crumbling as he stared at the face of his son. He stumbled forward, tears tracing paths through the dust on his cheeks as Maeve placed the child into his father's waiting arms. He cradled his son, a broken sob escaping him. In that shared gaze between 2 chiefs over the living bridge of a tiny baby, the promise of war washed away, replaced by shared grief and a common future. The journey home was quiet. When they reached her clearing, Taze dismounted and presented her with a turquoise necklace. "This was my sister's," Hask translated. "A gift. The Chiricahua do not forget. This land will know you are protected." Maeve watched them melt back into the wilderness. She stood on her porch, the turquoise cool against her skin, the same cabin, the same land. But she was no longer the same woman. Her solitude no longer felt like loneliness, but like peace. Maeve O'Connell's story is a powerful reminder that the greatest acts of courage often don't happen on a battlefield, but in the quiet, resolute choices of the human heart. It shows us that compassion is a universal language capable of bridging the deepest divides and rewriting destinies. In a world defined by conflict, she chose connection. Faced with overwhelming fear, she chose to protect a life, and in doing so, helped save the future for 2 nations. If this story of courage-sacrifice and the unlikely bonds that can form in the harshest of landscapes moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. It truly helps our channel grow and bring more incredible tales to light. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story from the forgotten corners of history. And we want to hear from you. What would you have done in Maeve's position? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening.